Ladies and gentlemen, long time no see. Hope you're all doing really, really good on this morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it may be that you're watching this podcast episode. And again, welcome back to another episode of the Tech 4 podcast with myself, Jake Youngs, and Jeffrey, Mr. Tech Raskin.
Woo-hoo!
Today we are kind of covering one of the biggest challenges of the real estate industry right now. How in the world do we get paid as real estate agents?
Yeah.
And yes, it is a good question for more reasons than one. I mean, of course, the first reason, because the market in Phoenix right now is kind of dried up, not to be that guy, but they're a little bit iffy out there at the moment.
As we're talking, it went up from 21,000 properties on the market. It went up to 22, 23, 24, and now we're at about 25,000 homes on the market as we're talking.
You see, I'm checking right now, and in ARM List, we've got 25,579 listings.
Exactly.
That's just the residential stuff, not even including rentals,
correct,
land, all that jazz.
Right.
But the short and sweet of it that we're trying to cover today is one of the major changes that we just hit in the real estate industry in the past, what was it, month and a half ago this change happened. Right. The CAB form went away. The commission agreement between brokers, I believe, is what it stood
I thought
for.
that was the wine that I drank.
I mean, maybe it was that too. But Jeff, here's the major challenge, and actually, I'm not going to go into detail, but you and I have both run into issues recently with agents not knowing how to appropriately get paid, especially when they're relying on the sellers to pay their compensation for them. So I want to gather your 2 cents real quick. With the CAB being gone, how do we go about getting paid in today's real estate world?
I want to start off with something that literally just happened to me today, no joke, on one of my listings.
Today, okay.
Today.
This is fresh.
Yeah, this is super fresh. So last night I received a contract for one of my listings, and they gave me the RPC, the Residence Purchase Contract. They gave me the signed SPUDs because I uploaded it properly into the document section of MLS. They even signed the clue, which I don't see, but that's cool. They signed the HOA addendum. This is beautiful. They send this all back to me. When they send it back to me, I didn't see that little box down there on page 1 marked called the SCA. And they didn't send me the SCA. So I'm like, wow, this is kind of interesting. It looks like this guy is being compensated directly from his buyer alone, not asking for anything from the seller.
Which is still pretty rare in today's market, to be
That's
fair.
the first time I've ever seen that. And so I'm like, okay, not a problem. I've seen it multiple times where the BA, the buyer's agent, doesn't call me up to ask how much the seller, if any, is offering compensation. But I've never seen an offer come through that doesn't have the SCA at all. And so we go ahead and we sign and we get it back to them. And the BA today literally says, by the way, how much is compensation? And I go, for you, 0. And he says, what do you mean 0? And I go, you didn't ask for any compensation. And he goes, no, we asked for that afterwards. And I'm like, no, you're too late for that. No joke that happened to me today. I hope he's not watching. And by the way, I didn't even mention your name. I'm going to call him George to protect the innocent.
Okay.
So George goes, what do you mean I'm not being compensated? I'm like, well, you're not being compensated from us. You might be compensated from your buyer because hopefully you signed what's called a buyer broker exclusive employment agreement or showing agreement, but you just aren't compensated from us. And he's like, what are you talking about? And so I explained to him the birds and the bees, and I explained to him how things work, and he was just silent. Literally, he's just silent. And I'm like, I'm not your broker. I can't go into more detail, but that's kind of what's going on. So people just don't know.
Wow.
People just don't know. And so I'm going to explain to you what has happened with my listings, my buyers, how to make sure that I get compensated, you get compensated, the rest of you out there get compensated.
Yeah.
And let's go over some of the forms and just make sure that we're doing it the right way.
Okay, so curious question for those of us who have not worked with any new forms since August 1st. The CAB was a very short-lived form. It was only out for, 4 months before it got the axe and went away?
I think it went a little bit longer than that, but nobody used it. I never used it. But in terms of it officially going away, It was pretty short-lived, yeah.
Yeah. So what was the actual purpose of the cab form, and how does that translate into the what we now know as the SCA, the Seller Compensation Addendum?
Well, keep in mind that there is no relationship between the cab and the SCA, kind of, right? So the compensation agreement from broker to broker, which, by the way, once again, I never used and I never received. So I just want to let you know, this is actually why it went away, according to AAR.
Just because it wasn't getting used?
It wasn't being used, and so they're like, yeah, we need to sunset that. And so they did.
Talk about forms that are not being used. Can we talk about the COVID-19 addendum that's still sitting in transaction desk?
Well, hold on. If you really want to talk about that, what about the short sale addendum, which you don't even know what that is, right?
Yeah.
I lived through 2008, right, where we did a lot of short sales, and that's why they come. So you have to remember, they come out with forms based on lawsuits that that come against us based on situations. And if you think about it, that's almost everything. Market condition advisory, right? So before 2008, before the crash, the market went like this, and we're like, oh my goodness gracious. We're like, buy. Then all of a sudden it just goes crash. And because of that, a lot of people are like, I now hold a home that's $100,000 less than what I paid for it. Hence the market condition advisory, because we got in a jam because of that one. Same thing with the short sale advisory. Same thing, or the short sale addendum. Same thing with the fair housing, right? The fair housing as well. We're like, hey, we're still getting sued because of fair housing. We have the fair housing addendum. Almost everything comes about because of lawsuits that come across our desk.
It's just like the RPC, the residential purchase contract. That was one sheet when it first came out, and we're now up to technically 11 pages if you're including the front checklist.
The first page. So exactly. So that's kind of what it comes down to, and the verbiage changes every once in a while and things like that. Okay. Of course, the ER changed recently. From the time we're recording this, in what are we at, middle of March?
Mid-March 2025.
2025. So anyways, you have to remember, just about a month ago, everybody, in the exclusive right to sell, or if you use the exclusive agency, you have to remember the buyer agent compensation line went bye-bye. So I just want to let you know, if your seller says to you as you're taking a listing, hey, by the way, your compensation is X%, and you say, okay, well, would you like to compensate the buyer's agent for anything? You're like, sure, I'll do it. Well, how much? And they go X% there. Well, I want to remind you, there is no place in there to actually write it, which is kind of crazy, very different from what we're used to.
So kind of interesting. That kind of translates into, if I'm remembering this correctly and reading this correctly, that the sellers aren't going to know if they're paying a buyer's agent until an offer comes along, nor will they know how much they're paying a buyer's agent until an offer comes along.
Which is bonkers and bonkers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this whole industry is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs right now.
It is. And you need to think about that, because we don't know what their bottom line is going to be, because we just don't know. Well, you might want to factor in, X% or maybe minus X%. We just don't know.
Yeah. I mean, usually whenever I build a net sheet, just to be safe, I usually factor in that extra 3% for a buyer's agent. But of course, make sure the sellers know.
Or any percent. It doesn't have to be that.
Yep. But just rough numbers. I'd much rather be conservative and lean towards the high end and say, hey, worst case scenario, this is what it looks like. Best case scenario, you don't pay anything extra for that agent. So I guess with that being said, how do buyer's agents really identify and figure out how much they're getting paid in a transaction?
Yeah. So the thing is, let's go. So I'm the BA. You're the LA, right? So the buyer's agent, listing agent. And so I'm usually, although it's not happening a lot, is to call you up. And I'm like, hi, Mr. Listing Agent. I'm Mr. Buyer's Agent. And I want to know, is your seller giving any compensation? Of course, the word commission has gone away. So now it's going to be compensation. And are they offering it? And you're going to say, click. Yes. Yeah, well, that's the first thing, right? And hopefully you're going to say either yay or nay. Now remember, if you say nay, I'm going to try to negotiate a little bit. I'm going to say, well, what happens if we put in this purchase price, and then you can go ahead and give us back for my compensation. I guess you could do that. Or if you say yay, my next question is going to be how much? And you're going to say, because this is actually happening out there,
0.1%.
You could say 1%, but remember, let's use X percent for now. But whatever the point, but it could be 0.0x percent, right? If you think about it. So what we're going to do is you're going to say, oh, okay. Or you could say, I'm not going to give you a number because we're going to base that number that we're going to compensate you as the BA based on the number that you're going to give to us in the RPC, the asking price. And I'm like, wait, what? So it's going to differ based on that. And that is probably the biggest difference, because you have to remember in, pre-August 1st of 2024, we had a BA commission that was directly in Flex MLS or whatever MLS you're using. And what happened is that it was right there. And it said, hey, by the way, X percent. So automatically, where technically is what they did is they negotiated your pay on your behalf.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are like, well, I'm glad it went away because don't negotiate on my behalf, because actually that's what you already did, unless you use the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement. And then even before that, if you say, I'm going to give you 2 apples, then I'm going to go back to the buyer's agent, I'm the buyer, then the buyer, I'm going to say, hey, you owe me 1 apple or whatever you do to make that total amount, to make me whole.
Yes.
And so the only difference is there is no set automatic amount for you to look at it. Everything is negotiable. So in other words, when I call you up and you go, hey, Jeff, yes, we are offering it. Okay, will you tell me how much? And you're like, no. I'm like, okay. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to write my RPC, the residential purchase contract, and then within there's going to be another addendum, and on the RPC page 1 at the very bottom where it says, what other documents are you attaching here? One of them is the HOA, one of them is the solar, there's a bunch of other, and one of them is going to be called the SCA, the Seller Compensation Addendum. And what you're going to do is you're going to fill it out as the buyer's agent. You're going to say, hi, I'm the buyer's agent, although that's already written for you, and I'm going to ask you to offset, is the new word of the day, to offset the amount that I'm charging my buyer. So in the buyer broker, I'm charging 3 apples, right? And when I charge this amount of apples, and if you're giving me, once again, I'm going to have to use numbers here, right? So if
I'm charging my buyer 3 apples, I'm asking you for 2.5 apples.
Well, no, I'd ask for 3 apples. Of course, I wanted to
3 apples,
compensate all of it. But if you say, hey, I'm only going to give you, my seller's only going to give you 2 apples, well, okay, then I'm going to go back to my buyer for 1 apple to make me whole at 3 apples.
Perfect sense.
I hope that makes sense. Now remember, let's say your buyer goes, you know what, I can't afford 1 apple. I'm a new buyer, I'm doing an FHA, I'm barely scraping by with my 3.5% that I have to put down.
If they can even afford the 3.5%.
If they can even do the 3.5%. So I can't afford more from you. You have the ability as the BA to lower it, although you have to do this on a form, and you can lower your compensation that you've already agreed on with the buyer. So if you say, hey, with the buyer, I've already agreed on 3 apples in the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement, I write in the SCA, I'm going to ask you, the listing agent through the seller, or the seller through the listing agent, and you say, nope, the most we're given is 2 apples, I'm going to go back to the buyer and say, I need 1 extra apple, or I can lower it for just the 2 apples. Okay?
Makes perfect sense.
Now, with that being said, I want to remind you of one other thing. If I negotiate with my buyer for 3 apples, and you go, hey, by the way, we're offering 4 apples.
You can't collect that extra apple.
You can't collect the extra apple. You could go down, but you can't go up. So, well, then where does the extra apple go?
Well, it either goes nowhere or it goes to the listing agent.
Actually, you would get your 4 apples, but 1 apple would probably go back actually to the buyer.
Really?
Yeah, which is kind of cool. So make sure they know that.
Right.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
by the same token now, we don't know for a fact what the seller is willing to offer.
We don't.
So, I mean, the seller could have planned on offering 5 apples, and then you bring your seller compensation addendum for 3, and it's like, yep, we're going to
Yep.
offer 3 apples, and that's going to be that.
And that's why. So remember, you might want to ask for high, although you're going to have this conversation with them because the buyer's going to be like, I'm not paying you 5 apples or 6 apples or 7 apples. But you're like, no, don't worry. You got to write this down. Nothing is verbal, right? And if it is 5 apples, well, you just satisfied it. But if it's less than that, you're like, don't worry, I'm not going to collect 5 apples, another 2 apples from you, or whatever the difference is.
So what exactly would be the process of bringing that compensation down? Not anything that any agent ever wants to do, I know, but what's the process of doing that?
Yeah, there's actually a form in Transaction S or whatever other form writing platform out there. There's multiple out there, but it is an AR, Arizona Association of Realtor form, and it is in there, and it actually is the buyer broker. It is called the buyer broker.
Isn't it like the buyer broker compensation addendum?
Yeah. You know what? I used it actually the other day. And there is a way to, I forgot the name of the addendum actually, right? And yeah, we're both looking it up at the same time.
Yeah, I know. We're both professionals over
here.
here.
Yeah, we're both professionals. I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right one. And I literally just used it the other day. And I just can't remember what
you've got the seller compensation addendum. You've got the unrepresented seller compensation agreement.
Correct.
You've got under the buyer, you've got the buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement to show a property and the exclusive employment agreement in general.
Correct.
Which form are we missing here?
I will tell you in just a little bit because
True professionals, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, 2 professionals. That's absolutely right. Well, here's the thing. Hopefully you aren't using it that often.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the first thing. It is called the...
It's not the additional clause addendum.
No, I was actually just looking at that coincidence because I know what the additional clause addendum is. So,
well, I hope we all know what that is. Yikes! I don't know, guys. We'll get back to you on it when we have an answer on this thing, because it appears as though this form has grown legs and walked away from Mr. Jeff over here.
Yeah.
So, kind of an interesting question. I want to go back to the very first story you were telling me about, the thing that happened to you just today. If somebody submits an offer and accidentally forgets to attach the SCA or even mark that there's an SCA, can they anyway get paid by the seller? Like, for example, if you counter back and they counter back with an SCA,
Right.
Can they still get paid that way?
Yeah. And that's a great question. Here's what I'm going to tell you is, and I actually explained this to him, and I told him I'm not your broker, but this is what I would do if I was your broker. I would say I would counter us out because we sent a counter back to them, but now if we would have signed it, as is, you're done, right? You're out. But we did send out a counteroffer, so he could send a counteroffer back to us and say, hey, by the way, I'm attaching the SCA, and that's what he could have done. Yeah, so the answer is yes, he could have done that. So,
or try and get the buyer into that inspection period, cancel, resubmit a new offer.
I guess, I don't know if you want to go through all of that just for that, but yes, you are absolutely right.
Well, actually, technically speaking, if you cancel the contract and then just immediately submit a brand new offer, wouldn't that be, I don't know, I feel like that would null and void your cancellation of the original contract for BS reasons.
Well, it would. So if you were to go down during the inspection period and you would to cancel it just altogether, oh, well, of course, it would just cancel out the whole thing and then you start over fresh. But I don't know if you would really want to go that route. It would just be extra paperwork, but yes, you technically could. By the way, yes, either you said it, I think you said it. The buyer tenant employment agreement addendum is what it's called. And,
okay.
and I think you mentioned that, and it says literally, this is an addendum to the above agreement dated, whatever you dated it, and then the buyer compensation, and it says buyer and broker agree to modify the broker compensation as follows, and then you would put in, by the way, it's going to be blah blah blah. So it is that one.
So you drop it down from 5 apples to 3 apples
And
once
that-
you find
that's what
out
we do, yeah.
what the seller is willing to pay.
Exactly. Now, I want to tell you what I think where the future is going.
He's got a crystal ball,
I
guys.
do have a crystal ball here, right? Call me the Raskin witch today with my crystal ball, or the wizard. I guess it would be the wizard, right?
Yeah.
It wouldn't be. Anyway, so here's what it comes down to. I think the SCA might be taken off as well.
Really?
And what I think might happen is I think they might add a line into the RPC. And what's interesting about it is that, I've been doing this since the year 2000, and they hammer it into our head. Remember, the purchase contract is between the buyer and seller, and you aren't part of it, so don't even mess with it. That's why we don't sign it, right? Because we're not part of it. Well, I think all of that history is going to go away. I think they're going to say, write it into the contract. And either you just write it in line 344 from the time we're talking, our current RPC, line 344 on page 7, something like that. Or so you could write it directly in there, or they're probably going to add another line, and it's going to say, buyer is asking seller to compensate their agent, their buyer agent, X% to represent them, or something to that effect.
That would make sense
Do what?
because you send the SCA as a part of your offer anyways.
Same
It's
thing.
just, instead of forgetting to attach a form to your offer,
That's
you
right.
can forget to fill out a line
The
for your
line
offer.
in the offer. That's absolutely right. So that's where I think our industry is going. Because remember, literally the Department of Justice, the DOJ, they want decoupling of commissions and compensations altogether. They don't want a listing agent through the seller. They don't want them compensating the BA or the brokerage at all. So if it was up to them, it would be the buyer pay the BA directly and the seller pay the LA directly. But it's not going to happen, hopefully, for a while yet. We're still asking.
It's not a very perfect world in that
it's definitely
respect.
not a perfect
Nobody
world.
would be able to really afford a buyer's agent if that became the case. However,
Well,
I
a
think,
lot of people. Some people would be like, this is the most expensive thing I'm ever buying. I'm more than happy to pay for representation. So
Right.
not everybody, but yes.
well, I think what's going to wind up happening at some point is kind of like you say, eventually we're probably going to get to the point where it's both parties paying their agents directly, no commingling of funds, shall we say.
Correct.
And I think sooner or later, I'm surprised we haven't really seen a whole lot of it already. There's probably going to be some form of a loan product that comes out that wraps that buyer's agent, the BA compensation up, into the amount getting financed to purchase the property. I thought that was going to be one of the first industry solutions when this whole thing started happening last year.
Right.
Because it's one of the most logical things to do. But I've heard a lot of pushback from a lot of different lenders about it. Like I've even had one saying, no, the lender will never pay the buyer's agent directly. Well, okay, sure, they're kind of paying them directly, but they're not. The buyer's taking out money. The money's going to title. Money goes to the seller, and then it goes back to the buyer's agent as well. So it's not the lender paying the money directly to the buyer's agent. I don't know. There's still a lot of formalities that are going to have to get sorted out there, but I think that's the road that everybody's going to wind up going down towards. Well, probably actually for the people who only have 3.5% to put down on a house, we're probably going to see a lot more 100% financing loan products come out so that people can finance 100% of the purchase price and use that 3.5% to pay for their closing costs, their inspection, and pay for their buyer's representation. Which, I don't know, we'll see what that does with housing affordability over the next couple of years. But what do you think? Does that make sense? Do you think that might be a viable direction?
I would, whenever you're asking to, for example, up the amount of the purchase price so you can get compensated, which, by the way, that's what I recommended to George, the agent, who didn't send me the SCA. And I said, hey, look, we're happy to do it, but since I already told the seller not to expect to compensate you because you didn't send it in, so what can I do, Jeff? And I said, well, you can raise the price by whatever you want.
But then you got to go back to some pissed off buyers who are like, oh, we got to spend $15,000, $20,000 more on a
But once
house.
again, he wasn't educated enough to know that 7 months ago, we literally got rid of, and so, yeah, not the greatest agent in the world. Hopefully you're not watching. But anyways, but that's really what it comes down to, because they didn't just educate himself to realize that that doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, I just couldn't believe it. So bottom line is, could he say, well, I'm going to tell you. So let's say it was a $500,000 home, right? And I said, look, if you want your compensation at this point, at least the seller to pay for it, raise it to, let's say you want $10,000, raise the asking price to $510,000, and then we're going to go in and we're going to compensate you this much. But I would run it by the LO, the loan originator, lender, before you do anything, because it's all going to be up to the lender and their programs whether they can do it or not. I think that's super important.
And whether or not the house can even qualify for that amount of money either.
Which, by the way, that's the other thing. You need to make sure it's going to appraise for that, which is the other factor there.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think that was pretty good.
I thought it was great.
Guys, we're going to leave you right there for this episode. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Tech 4 podcast, and we will see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Have a great day, guys.